The first thing to go was my balance. One moment I was standing at my kitchen counter counting the seconds between breaths, the way I always did when my blood sugar felt off. The next the room tilted slow and heavy like the floor had decided to move without me. My hands began to shake. Not a little tremor, the kind that makes you drop things you've held 1,000 times before. I remember thinking very clearly, this doesn't make sense. I had taken my insulin exactly the way I always did. Same pen, same dose, same time. I had built my life around that kind of precision because with type 1 diabetes, guessing isn't an option. You either respect the rules or your body reminds you why they exist. My legs buckled before I could reach the chair. I went down hard, my shoulder hitting the cabinet, my cheek pressed against the cold tile. My heart was racing, but my thoughts were slowing, slipping out of order. I heard a voice somewhere above me, calm and almost amused. "Marissa, stop it," my sister said. "You're fine, you're doing that thing again." That thing, as if my body shutting down was a habit I'd picked up for attention. I lay there on the floor of my Minneapolis apartment, trying to pull air into lungs that suddenly felt too small. My glucose monitor buzzed weakly against my arm, numbers dropping faster than they ever should have. I lifted my hand to show her, but my fingers wouldn't cooperate. Tessa stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I couldn't read at first. Not panic, not concern. If anything, she looked settled, like this was unfolding exactly the way she expected. "You didn't take your insulin right," she said. "You never listen, and now you want to blame me." I tried to speak. My tongue felt thick, unresponsive. The room dimmed at the edges. Somehow muscle memory took over. I crawled inch by inch toward my phone. I don't remember dialing. I only remember the sound of my own breathing echoing too loudly in my ear, and Tessa's voice drifting in and out, telling me to calm down, telling me I was being dramatic. When the paramedics arrived, everything moved faster than my thoughts could follow. Hands questioned straps. Someone said my name and told me to stay with them. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I caught one last glimpse of my sister. She was smiling. Not a wide smile, not a cruel one. Just a small, contained curve of the lips, like she was relieved something annoying had finally proven her point. At the hospital, the doctors stabilized me. They said I was lucky, that another few minutes without effective insulin could have gone very differently. I nodded and thanked them the way people do when they're still too shaken to argue with reality. But later, alone in the narrow bed with the machines humming softly around me, one thought kept returning, steady and impossible to ignore. Insulin doesn't just stop working, not like that. And whatever had happened to my body on that kitchen floor hadn't been an accident. I spent the night listening to machines breathe for me. By the time morning light filtered through the narrow hospital window, my body had stabilized enough for the doctors to stop hovering. My blood sugar was back in range. My hands were steady again. On paper, I was improving. Inside, I felt hollowed out, like something essential had cracked open and refused to close. My mother arrived first. Laurel Caldwell had always had a way of entering rooms as if she were already tired of whatever awaited her. She took one look at me in the bed, then at the monitor beside me, and sighed. "I told you," she said, setting her purse down with careful precision. "You push yourself too hard. This is what happens." She said it the way some people talk about weather. Unfortunate, but inevitable. No blame, no curiosity. When I tried to explain that I had taken my insulin exactly as prescribed, she waved it away. "You've always been anxious about your health, Marissa. Ever since you were a teenager, you read too much. You catastrophize." Tessa arrived a few minutes later, coffee in hand, relaxed like this was an inconvenience she had already mentally moved past. She leaned against the wall, scrolling on her phone, while my mother spoke for both of them. "She scared us," Tessa said without looking up. "She does that sometimes." Sometimes. That word landed heavier than anything else. I had lived with type 1 diabetes since I was 12. I had learned early how much discipline it took to stay alive without making a spectacle of it. I learned to count quietly, to excuse myself politely, to swallow fear so other people wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, my silence had been mistaken for exaggeration. The nurse assigned to my discharge came in later that morning. She was in her 40s, efficient but kind, the kind of professional who had seen enough not to dramatize things that mattered. She asked me about my insulin routine, where I kept my supplies, whether anyone else had access. When I said my sister had been staying with me the night before, the nurse paused for just a moment, not long enough to alarm me, just long enough to register. Any interruption in insulin, she said carefully, especially for someone as consistent as you can be, extremely dangerous. It's not something we brush off. My mother laughed lightly. She gets worked up, that's all. The nurse didn't argue. She just nodded and made a note in my chart. That small, quiet gesture stayed with me. Later, after my family left to give me rest, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how familiar this all felt. Every milestone in my life had been filtered through the same lens. If I struggled, it was because I was fragile. If Tessa succeeded, it was because she was capable. Even the family business followed that pattern. North Star Home Medical had been my grandmother's pride. A small chain of medical supply stores across the Twin Cities. After she passed, the operational control went to my uncle and eventually to Tessa. I had inherited voting shares, but no one expected me to use them. I had built my career elsewhere in healthcare compliance, far from family entanglements. It was easier for everyone that way. By the time the doctor cleared me for discharge, I understood something I hadn't fully admitted before. What frightened me most wasn't the episode itself. It was how quickly the people closest to me decided it hadn't really happened. As I gathered my things, the insulin pen sitting innocently in my bag, a quiet thought took shape. If no one believed me now, they never would. I didn't sleep much after I got home. The apartment felt the same quiet hum of the refrigerator, the same stack of mail on the little table by the door. But my sense of safety had shifted. I kept seeing the kitchen tile. I kept hearing Tessa's voice, steady and impatient, like my body had inconvenienced her. I set my bag down and took out what I'd carried home like a fragile secret, my insulin pen. It sat there in my hand, light and ordinary, the way something life-saving always looks when you've gotten used to relying on it. I stared at it longer than I needed to, not because I expected it to confess, but because I needed to know I hadn't lost my mind. I went into the bathroom and washed my hands the way the nurse had taught me years ago, slow, deliberate, a ritual. Then I pulled my diabetes kit onto the counter and laid everything out. Meters, test strips, alcohol swabs, needles. A spare vial I kept in the back of the fridge for emergencies. My continuous glucose monitor receiver. The pen I'd been using. I checked the pen first. At a glance, nothing looked wrong. The label had my pharmacy sticker, my name printed cleanly, the date, the dosage. But when I rotated it in the light, I noticed the edge of the sticker wasn't pressed down the way it usually was. One corner had a tiny lift to it, just enough to catch your fingernail if you weren't careful. My heart tightened. I told myself it could be nothing. Heat, moisture, normal wear. Still, I picked up the pen and examined the safety seal around the cap. It wasn't broken, not exactly. It was off. The plastic ring sat a fraction higher than I remembered, like it had been removed and reseated by someone who didn't quite know how to make it look untouched. The liquid inside looked too clear. Insulin is supposed to look clear, yes, but there's a difference between clear and empty. This looked like plain water, thin, flat, almost too bright. I didn't trust my eyes alone. I took out the spare vial from the fridge, the one I'd kept untouched. My hands were steady now, but my stomach wasn't. I used a new needle, a clean swab, and followed every step the way I always did. No shortcuts, no room for later blame. Within minutes, my body responded the way it always had when insulin was actually insulin. The heaviness in my limbs eased. The sick, drifting feeling pulled back. The numbers on my monitor stopped dropping and began to stabilize. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, breathing carefully. It wasn't me. I wasn't forgetting doses. I wasn't catastrophizing. My body hadn't staged a tantrum. Something had happened to that pen. I wrapped it in a clean zip-top bag and set it on the highest shelf in my kitchen cabinet, like it was evidence because I didn't have a better word for it yet. Then I opened my calendar and counted backward. The only people who had been inside my apartment in the last week were me and my family. My mother, Laurel, had stopped by briefly, as she always did, long enough to make a comment about my little routines and then leave. And Tessa had stayed longer. She'd insisted on helping moving things around with confident hands. Opening drawers I didn't ask her to open, acting like she knew my home better than I did. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone out loud. Not yet. Not without something I could put in front of a stranger and say, "This is real." So I did the next best thing. I called my endocrinology clinic and told the receptionist as calmly as I could that I believed my insulin had been tampered with. I asked what to do with the pen, how to preserve it, who to speak to. When she transferred me to a nurse, I heard the shift in tone the moment I said the words "replaced" and "collapse." She didn't tell me who did it. She didn't need to. She told me to keep the pen sealed and bring it in. She told me to document everything: dates, symptoms, hospital records. And she told me softly that if I felt unsafe, I should involve law enforcement. When I hung up, I looked at the cabinet where the bagged pen sat hidden behind cereal boxes. A first clue doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like the moment you realize you've been living among people who could hurt you and still call you dramatic for bleeding. I went to the police station on a Monday morning, the kind of gray Minneapolis morning that makes everything feel heavier than it should. The building itself looked ordinary enough. Brick glass people coming and going with coffee cups in hand, but walking through the doors felt like stepping into a place where my life would no longer belong entirely to me. I carried a folder pressed flat against my chest. Inside were copies of my hospital discharge papers, printouts from my glucose monitor, and a single sealed bag I hadn't opened since the night before. The insulin pen rested inside it, light as nothing, heavy as truth. At the front desk, a uniformed officer asked how he could help me. I told him I needed to file a report. He raised his eyebrows slightly, the way people do when they're bracing for something inconvenient, and asked what kind. "Medication tampering," I said. That earned me a longer look. He led me to a small interview room with a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. After a few minutes, a detective came in, middle-aged, tired eyes, polite but clearly measured. He introduced himself, sat down, and asked me to start from the beginning. I told him about my diabetes, about the collapse in my kitchen, about the hospital. I slid the glucose logs across the table, pointing out the timestamps where my levels dropped despite having taken insulin. I explained how the backup vial had worked when the pen hadn't. He listened without interrupting, but his face didn't change. When I mentioned my sister, he paused. "So this is a family situation," he said carefully. The words weren't unkind, but they carried weight. Family situations, I knew, were where urgency went to die. "I'm not here because of a disagreement," I said. "I'm here because something meant to keep me alive didn't." He nodded and made a note. He asked who had access to my apartment. I told him about the spare key, about my mother and my sister. I did not accuse anyone. I stuck to facts the way my job had trained me to do. When I placed the sealed bag with the insulin pen on the table, he didn't touch it. He asked if I had opened it since the incident. I told him no. He told me that was good. Still, I could feel the distance, the skepticism, the quiet calculation of whether this would turn into nothing. "This kind of case can be difficult," he said, "especially without a witness." I asked for a case number anyway. He gave me one. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even momentum. But it was a line drawn in ink instead of air. Before I left, I asked what I should do next. He told me to keep documenting everything and to call if I remembered any additional details. He also reminded me gently that investigations take time. Time was exactly what frightened me. Outside, I sat in my car for a long moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing until the tightness in my chest eased. Then I made one more call. My healthcare network had a patient safety and compliance office, a department I knew well from the professional side of my life. Reporting something there meant paperwork reviews delays. It also meant the complaint would exist in a system that didn't care about family dynamics. I explained what had happened just as I had to the police. The woman on the line listened quietly and gave me a reference number. She told me someone would follow up. When I finally drove home, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Why are you making this so serious?" she wrote. "You're embarrassing everyone." I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a moment before I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. By the end of the day, nothing dramatic had happened. No arrests, no accusations, no apologies, just a report filed, a number assigned, and the growing awareness that I had stepped into a process I could no longer control. And somewhere between the police station and my apartment, I understood something else. If I backed out now, no one would ever protect me but myself. By Wednesday afternoon, I was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. The police report existed now, so did the reference number from my healthcare network. On paper, I had done what people tell you to do when something goes wrong. In reality, nothing felt resolved. The insulin pen sat untouched in my kitchen cabinet, sealed and silent, like it was waiting for someone else to decide whether my life had been put at risk on purpose or by accident. That was when I made the call I had been putting off. Erin Klein answered on the second ring. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since she'd come to my apartment long ago to help me adjust my insulin routine after a dosage change. She was a registered nurse, practical and calm. The kind of person who didn't waste words or soften facts. I told her who I was. There was a pause, then recognition. "Are you okay?" she asked. That question alone nearly undid me. We met the next morning at a small clinic near downtown Minneapolis where she worked part-time, doing intake assessments. It wasn't a dramatic place, just fluorescent lights, neutral walls, the low murmur of people waiting their turn. Erin led me into a quiet room and closed the door. I placed the sealed bag on the table between us. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She picked it up carefully, turning it just enough to see the cap, the label, the seal. Her face didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "This isn't right," she said, not loudly, not with certainty meant to impress. Just flat truth. She pointed out small things I hadn't trusted myself to name out loud, the way the seal sat, the way the liquid reflected light. She told me she'd seen refilled insulin pens before, almost always connected to improper handling or diversion. People cutting corners, people trying to stretch inventory. I felt cold spread through my chest. Then she hesitated, fingers resting on the edge of the table. "There's something else," she said. "I need to be careful how I say this." She told me that in recent months she'd noticed irregularities connected to North Star Home Medical. Boxes logged incorrectly, pens that didn't match their lot numbers. Nothing she could accuse anyone of yet. Nothing she'd had proof to escalate on her own. "But seeing this," she said quietly, nodding toward the bag, "makes me uncomfortable in a way I can't ignore." I asked her if she would put that in writing. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked me if I was prepared for what that might do. To my family, to my name, to the business tied to it. I thought of my mother's text, of Tessa's smile, of the floor pressing into my cheek while my body failed. "Yes," I said. After we parted, I stopped by my pharmacy. I didn't accuse anyone there either. I asked questions. I requested my refill history. When the pharmacist printed it out and slid it across the counter, one line stood out immediately. An insulin refill had been picked up under my name. On a Tuesday afternoon. I had been at work that day in a meeting that ran long, my calendar and email trail clear as daylight. Someone else had signed for my medication. I sat in my car afterward, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't a feeling. It was a pattern forming piece by piece. I understood then that staying quiet wasn't neutral. It wasn't patience. It was permission. Whatever came next, I would not pretend this was small. I would not let anyone turn my body into a convenient lie. Thursday felt different the moment I woke up. Not calmer, not braver, just clearer. I laid everything out on my dining table before I left the apartment: the sealed insulin pen, the pharmacy printout, copies of my glucose logs, the hospital discharge summary, and a notebook where I'd written dates and times in careful block letters. I wasn't building a case to convince anyone emotionally. I was building something that could stand even if no one liked me. I drove to St. Paul that morning to meet an attorney named Daniel Rourke. Aaron had given me his name with a quiet warning. He handled healthcare fraud and patient harm cases, and he didn't sugarcoat outcomes. That was exactly what I needed. His office was modest, no dramatic views, just shelves of binders and the faint smell of coffee that had been reheated too many times. He listened while I spoke, barely interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said, "this isn't a misunderstanding. It's reckless endangerment. And potentially more." He didn't tell me what to do. Instead, he told me what would happen if I did nothing. The report would stall. The paper trail would thin. And if this had happened once, it could happen again to me or to someone else who wouldn't catch it in time. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger, not fear, resolve. From his office, I made 2 calls. The first was to the detective handling my police report. I told him I had additional documentation and a third-party medical professional willing to speak. His tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to hear the gears turning. The second call was to my healthcare network's compliance hotline. This time, I wasn't just a patient reporting harm. I was a compliance analyst speaking their language. Vendor access, chain of custody, risk exposure. The woman on the line took careful notes and gave me a follow-up appointment. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing. My mother didn't bother with pretense anymore. "What are you doing?" she demanded when I answered. "Do you have any idea what this is going to do to our family?" I told her calmly, that my body had nearly shut down because someone interfered with my medication. "That's not what happened," she snapped. "You don't know that. You're making accusations you can't take back." "I'm documenting facts," I said. "What happens next isn't up to me." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "You always do this," she said. "You take things too far. You can still stop." That was the moment I understood the real cost of silence. Stopping wouldn't restore peace. It would only confirm that my safety was negotiable. "I'm not stopping," I said. "Please don't contact me about this again." She hung up on me. Later that evening, Tessa texted, "You're blowing this up for no reason. If you keep pushing, people are going to start asking questions you don't want answered." I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone down. Questions were exactly what I wanted now. I packed the evidence back into the folder and placed it by the door, ready for the next day. I changed the locks on my apartment and updated my pharmacy profile to require photo ID and a passcode for pickups. Small actions, necessary ones. Crossing a line doesn't feel dramatic when you do it quietly. It feels like choosing not to step back when everyone expects you to. And once I crossed it, there was no going back to pretending this was just a family problem. The interview was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. By then, I had learned how to sit with waiting without mistaking it for peace. The Minneapolis Police Department felt different this time. Not unfamiliar, but heavier. I wasn't walking in to file paperwork. I was walking in to be spoken about while sitting in the room. Tessa arrived before I did. I saw her through the glass doors as I parked tailored jacket hair, pulled back neatly, phone pressed to her ear, as she laughed at something I couldn't hear. She looked like someone heading into a meeting she expected to win. When she spotted me, she smiled and gave a small wave like we were late for lunch together. Inside, we were led to separate rooms. A detective I recognized from before explained the process again, slow and careful. He reminded me that this was still an interview, not an accusation. He asked if I understood. I did. Through the wall, I could hear the low cadence of another voice, Tessa's steady, confident, unbothered. I pictured her the way she always handled pressure, by making it look like nothing touched her. When it was my turn, I answered questions the same way I had answered every question so far. Dates, names, facts. I handed over the updated packet Daniel had helped me organize. The detective nodded and left the room with it. That was when the door opened again. Erin stepped inside. She wore scrubs and a light jacket, her hair pulled back the way it had been the first time she'd ever knocked on my apartment door years ago. She looked at me, gave a brief nod, and then turned to the officers. I was asked to speak, she said. No hesitation, no apology. I wasn't in the room when she gave her statement, but I didn't need to be. I could feel the shift anyway. The air changed. People moved more quickly down the hall. Voices lowered. Doors opened and closed with purpose instead of habit. Later, one of the detectives returned and asked me to wait. Minutes stretched. Then someone new entered the room, a tall man with silver hair and a posture that suggested authority without needing to announce it. He introduced himself as the chief of police. He didn't sit. We have a medical professional on record, he said, who has identified indicators consistent with medication tampering. We also have preliminary information suggesting possible diversion tied to a licensed supplier. He paused, looking directly at me. This is no longer a contained matter. From the hallway came a sharp sound, a chair scraping back too fast. Tessa's voice rose tight and unfamiliar, demanding to know what was happening. For the first time since this began, she sounded uncertain. The chief gave a brief set of instructions to the officers in the room. Phones came out, notes were taken. Someone mentioned securing records. Someone else said state level. No one looked at me like I was dramatic. When I was finally allowed to leave, Tessa was still there, standing rigidly near the wall. Her smile was gone. In its place was something sharper, calculation mixed with fear. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly as I passed. I didn't stop. Outside, my phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number warned me to be careful. Another accused me of trying to destroy what our grandmother built. The words came fast, messy, desperate. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I had set in motion. This wasn't just about me anymore. I sat in my car and stared at the police station until my hands stopped shaking. The truth had been spoken out loud in a place where it couldn't be taken back. That didn't mean justice was finished. It meant it had begun. The days after the police station blurred together, not because nothing happened, but because too much did. By Friday, my phone barely stayed quiet. Missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Emails marked urgent without context. Messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly invested in my well-being. All of them carrying the same undercurrent: slow down. Be careful, think about the family. I stopped responding. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and did what I knew how to do best. I traced systems, I followed patterns, I separated noise from structure. The compliance office scheduled a formal interview for the following week. In the meantime, they asked for everything: emails, pharmacy records, appointment logs, access permissions. I sent it all organized and time-stamped. Not arguments. Documentation, Daniel called that afternoon. They're circling, he said, which means someone's scared. He explained that once a case like this crossed from local police into regulatory review control shifted, businesses got nervous. People started protecting themselves instead of each other. That shift showed up quickly. North Star Home Medical sent out a vague internal notice about temporary operational reviews. Store managers were instructed not to speak to press or investigators without counsel. Vendor accounts were quietly flagged. None of it made the news yet, but it didn't have to. Inside the system, the alarm was already ringing. Tessa didn't wait long to reach out again. She showed up at my apartment building late Sunday afternoon, standing in the lobby like she belonged there. I didn't let her upstairs. We spoke through the glass, the security desk between us. "You're taking this too far," she said, her voice low and controlled. "They're looking at everything now. Do you know what that means?" "It means they're doing their jobs," I said. Her jaw tightened. "This doesn't end the way you think it does," she said. "You're not built for this." For the first time, I saw something slip. Not guilt, not remorse, fear. The fear of someone who had always relied on the system bending quietly in her favor. After she left, I reviewed my notes again and noticed something I hadn't focused on before. The refill picked up under my name wasn't just irregular. It coincided with a bulk order North Star had placed the same week. Same distributor, same delivery window. Individually, each detail was small. Together, they formed a clean line. I forwarded the observation to Aaron and to the compliance team, framing it as a question, not an accusation. Could these timelines overlap by coincidence? Aaron called me an hour later. "No," she said simply. That was the moment chaos turned into direction. I wasn't chasing my sister anymore. I wasn't trying to convince my mother. This wasn't even about my body, not entirely. It was about access. About who could touch what and how often they'd done it without being questioned. I updated my strategy quietly. No confrontations. No emotional appeals. I let the system do what it was designed to do when given clean information. That night, I slept for the first time without replaying the kitchen floor in my mind. The net was tightening, and for the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting. I was positioning. The first arrest happened on a Thursday morning. I didn't witness it. I heard about it the way most people hear about things they once thought impossible, through a clipped phone call and a pause on the other end of the line that said more than words could. Daniel called while I was at work. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded precise. "They picked up one of the regional managers at North Star," he said. "Questioning related to diversion and falsified records. This is moving." After that, everything accelerated. By the end of the day, compliance officers had suspended North Star's supplier credentials pending investigation. Pharmacies began pulling stock. Clinics stopped accepting deliveries. The business that had once moved quietly in the background of our family life was suddenly very visible, and not in the way anyone wanted. Tessa called me that night. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was short this time. "Stripped of polish. Stripped of certainty. They're saying my name," she said. "You need to tell them to stop." The next morning, my mother showed up at my apartment. She looked smaller than I remembered. Tired. Her confidence, once sharp enough to cut through any room, had dulled into something brittle. She stood in the hallway and asked if she could come in. I said no. She told me the police had been asking questions about access logs, keys, signatures. She told me lawyers were expensive. She told me families don't survive this kind of thing. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "Money and apology." I looked at her and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. "I want the truth on record," I said. "That's all." She left without another word. That afternoon, the call I had been bracing for came. A detective informed me that Tessa had been taken into custody for questioning related to medical tampering and fraud. The words sounded unreal even as I repeated them back to make sure I understood. I sat at my kitchen table after the call ended, staring at the place where the insulin pen had once sat sealed and untouched. I thought of how close my body had come to giving out. How easily this could have been written off as a mistake if I had been quieter, more accommodating. By evening, news outlets were calling it an ongoing investigation. No names yet. Just a story about a regional medical supplier under scrutiny and allegations of compromised medication. But inside our family, there was no ambiguity left. Texts came in from cousins, aunts, people who had never questioned Tessa's competence or my fragility. Some were angry, some were afraid. None of them asked how I was. That night, Daniel emailed me an update. Multiple arrests were expected. Financial records were being subpoenaed. Charges were likely. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. Justice, I was learning, doesn't arrive with relief. It arrives with weight. With the knowledge that something irreversible has occurred and that everyone involved will have to carry it differently. I wasn't lightened by what was happening, but I was no longer invisible. And whatever came next, it would be built on truth instead of silence. The case concluded on a quiet Monday morning, months after my body first collapsed on the kitchen floor. There was no courtroom drama, no speeches, just documents, finalized charges entered, and consequences assigned with the steady certainty of a system doing what it was designed to do once truth had been allowed in. Tessa pleaded guilty to charges related to medical tampering and fraud. The sentence wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. She lost her professional licenses. She was barred from working in any role that involved medical access or supply management. The judge called her actions reckless and dangerous, noting that someone else might not have survived what I did. North Star Home Medical dissolved within weeks. Contracts were terminated, assets liquidated, investigations expanded beyond what any of us had imagined at the beginning. What my grandmother built wasn't destroyed by the truth. It was already rotting beneath the surface. My mother accepted a plea agreement tied to obstruction and conspiracy. She avoided trial, but not accountability. We haven't spoken since. I don't expect we ever will. When it was over, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. I returned the sealed insulin pen to the clinic for final documentation. Watching it disappear into an evidence container felt symbolic in a way I hadn't expected. That small object had held so much fear, so much disbelief. Letting it go felt like reclaiming my body from a story that never should have been written. I changed my routine slowly. New pharmacy, new locks, new boundaries. I stopped explaining my health to people who treated it like an inconvenience. I stopped waiting for understanding from those invested in misunderstanding me. Erin and I stayed in touch. We meet for coffee now sometimes just to talk about ordinary things. She never once asked me if it had been worth it. She didn't need to. What surprised me most was how quiet life became once the noise stopped. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was steady blood sugar readings, mornings without dread, evenings where I wasn't replaying conversations in my head, wondering how I could have said things differently. I used to believe that justice would feel like vindication, like someone finally admitting they were wrong. It doesn't. Justice feels like not having to prove yourself anymore, like knowing your safety is no longer negotiable, like choosing peace without asking permission from the people who denied it to you. I didn't forgive my family. I released them. There is a difference. I live alone now, but not lonely. I trust my body again. I trust my instincts. And for the first time, I trust that telling the truth clearly, calmly, and without apology is enough. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose truth over family peace or walk away in order to heal? You're welcome to share your experience below, and if these stories matter to you, you can follow along for the next one. Some truths take time, but they're always worth telling.